All right, well, like Kaylee said, I am one of the leaders here at Regroup and the campus minister at our 33rd Street jail campus. And it's my pleasure to have the opportunity to be here tonight with y'all and share one of my favorite topics. So if this is your first night in our curriculum that we're going through, currently we're in this return phase. And Chris and Kaylee rather affectionately refer to this as the bowel movement of Regroup, mostly because it's in this phase that we revisit all of the crap from our lives. We write, we speak about the most painful stories and experiences from our past. 2 weeks ago, we got to hear a message from Chris Burns as he described to us this topic of the wound, the message, and the agreement. So we explored how painful and hurtful events in our lives can teach us things about ourselves that are simply not true. And often unwillingly, we find that we believe these messages and they affect how we think, how we feel, how we behave in our lives. We talked about how important digging up these old wounds is in the healing process. And tonight we get to talk through some of the practical application of how we actually do that. So tonight we look at one of my favorite topics at Regroup. It's called the tree, simply put. In a way, it distills the entire process of Regroup into one incredibly useful diagram because I like visual learning, I like pictures, I like analogies. This is my favorite. Perhaps more than anything, this might be the most useful diagram that we use here at Regroup. For me, it was. What I don't like about tonight is how little time we actually have to go through this content. When I'm teaching this in Regroup at the jail, this is like a 5 or 6 week long talk. And so tonight we get maybe a half hour to do 6 weeks worth of work. So hold on, we're gonna try and get through it. But so for me, once I began to understand this concept, how the tree worked in my own life, it became a powerful tool in helping to sort out my own thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. When I first came to Regroup almost 7 years ago, it was initially depression that brought me through the doors. I didn't like how my life looked, and I quickly found out, though I hated to admit it, what I was really here for was an addiction to sex and pornography. Regroup has a way of feeling like it can bait and switch you sometimes, and you think you come here for one thing, and then you find out, well, okay, here's what I'm here for. So if that's you, you're not alone. What I found is that my frequent, obsessive, out of control use of pornography was destroying my relationships. It was eroding my self-worth and smothering me in shame. Yet though I was aware of the damage I was causing myself, I didn't understand my behaviors. I kept going back over and over to this same place that I didn't want to go to. I didn't understand how I could do that. It was empty, but I kept returning there. I felt like I had absolutely no control over my behaviors. So this tree diagram, along with journaling and inventory, helped me begin to understand a little more about why I did the things I did. It helped me make sense of all of my confusing actions. So here's a picture of the tree. Thank you, Kaylee. The top part of the tree, the fruit, the leaves, the branches, all of that represents our behaviors. We're not going to spend a ton of time here, mostly because often we're able to recognize these areas in our life without much searching, much digging. Even if we don't understand them, we notice our behaviors. Sometimes there are people close to us that point out in our life, okay, you're doing this thing that's damaging or unhealthy. But my guess is that chances are if you're sitting here tonight, there's in some way life isn't working. And so you're aware a little bit of these behaviors. So the fruit on your tree might be alcohol, pornography, anger, misuse of prescription drugs, legalism, disordered eating. I mean, the list really is almost infinite. But it represents the ways that we approach life, but end up hurting ourselves, damaging our relationships, or most of the time, doing both. So what I think is most important to learn about the branches, the fruit, like this part of the tree, is just to recognize that it simply reflects the health of the rest of the tree. A couple weeks ago, maybe about a month now, we had a storm. It wasn't like a hurricane storm or anything like that, but I wake up and I look out my back window, and this massive tree has just fallen over in my backyard. And so we went and looked at it, and essentially it had completely severed itself from the roots. Now, this used to be, picture, if you will, a magnificent grapefruit tree, the biggest grapefruit tree you've ever seen. And it produced the most lovely fruit that you've ever tasted. I don't really like grapefruits, but I love the grapefruits that came from this tree. Well, over time, one year it produced less fruit than it had the year before. The next year it produced no fruit. Then the leaves started dying and branches started breaking off. And I realized that the tree itself was diseased. Now, I could blame the fruit for being bad, but ultimately, if the tree wasn't healthy, it wasn't going to produce any fruit. And the tree got diseased. And what we ended up finding when my roommate and I took an axe to go create firewood out of the tree that had fallen in our backyard, what we noticed was insects had eaten all through every single branch, every single, the trunk of the tree. They had eaten through enough of the base of the tree that when a tiny wind blew, and we didn't have any hurricanes recently, when a tiny wind came through our backyard, it just pushed that tree over because of the damage and the rotting that had happened inside that tree for all of those years. And the early signs of that was that fruit started to disappear, started to die. And so the illustration is the fruit just reflects the health of the rest of the tree. And so if we want to understand why we do the things we have to do, we have to look at the health of the tree. So for us to obsess about our behaviors without looking at the health of the tree would be fruitless. And there's a pun there for some of you guys. You can try it. One person. All right. Mark it down. You can try to prune and cut back these behaviors all you want. But unless you take care of the health of the tree, what's going to happen is new things might grow out in places that you didn't expect to. And so in the addiction world, this is known as switching or substituting. Instead of healing from a drug addiction, for example, sex and cigarettes tend to grow in its place. We just trade our addictions, our coping mechanisms. So the most important lesson here, hiding or cutting branches does not actually make the tree healthier. We must go deeper into the tree. And so that brings us to the trunk. The trunk that feeds the branches represents our emotions. This is important because generally the behaviors we don't like in our lives are correlated to things that we feel that we wish we didn't feel. Thus, our behaviors, such as drinking, looking at pornography, become ways that we avoid dealing with these emotions. You may have heard these behaviors referred to before as coping strategies. The principle is important because the energy of addiction is escape. Life can seem too hard, too messy, too painful, too lonely. And acting out provides some sort of comfort, some sort of control. The energy of addiction is escape. And often we want to escape these feelings. And so we behave in a way that numbs us to those. I don't know if your family of origin was anything like mine, but similar to other addictive family systems, emotions really didn't exist for us growing up. At least I wasn't taught anything about them. I think they were there, but we just didn't talk about them, we weren't aware of them. And so I didn't know what they were, how they felt in my body, how they impacted me, let alone how to deal with them in a healthy way. Our emotions, in a way, were fine and try harder. There was no place for anger or sadness in our house. And I can remember countless nights growing up where I just would spend most of my time alone in my room, crying, trying to make sense of this crazy world. I learned early on that my family wasn't a safe place to process my emotions, to learn how to deal with them. And so I discovered very quickly how to ignore them, how to bury them. Trouble was, avoiding my emotions, burying them perpetually, somehow didn't resolve them. Surprise. It only served to pressurize them over time. And so I discovered at an early age that I could find some escape from those pressurized emotions that I was incompetent to deal with. I found escape in the momentary relief offered through pornography and masturbation. That was the fruit on my tree. I could, for a short time, forget about how I felt by experiencing this high that sex produced. The energy of addiction is escape. And so it makes sense how a pattern of coping like this over time would develop into an addiction. So you can see from our diagram of the tree here how emotions feed into our behaviors. We start to behave in ways that keep us from having to interact with or feel our emotions. Though if you've ever tried this for any amount of time, you're likely aware that it doesn't work, at least for too long. So if burying our emotions doesn't work, what are we supposed to do with them? What are they even? This is the analogy I like to use. Emotions are like lights on the dashboard of your car. When my gas light comes on, it indicates. Emotions are indicators. It indicates that my car is low on fuel, and I had better attend to that before it runs out of gas. In my life, I had been taught to ignore my emotions, that they were somehow bad or not masculine, and so I effectively just continued putting duct tape right over that light. Years, light comes on, duct tape. Not going to pay attention to it. Acting out helped me to cope with the emotions until I became addicted and was powerless over my addiction. But after burying my emotions for most of my life, I found myself in my mid-20s with a major depression that pretty much rendered me powerless. And you can imagine there's only so long you can put duct tape over the gas light on your car before it is broken down on the side of the road. And so I couldn't figure out here why my life wasn't working, why my car felt broken down and useless. Emotions, like dashboard lights, indicate that something is wrong, that something is in need of attention. Some cars these days have a tire pressure light that indicate your tires need attention. However, it's not enough just to be aware of the indicator. If you don't put air in your tires, you're going to be in trouble soon. So emotions are not just indicators, they're also invitations. And I'll talk more about what that means in a second. But in our example here, if the gas light indicates that you are low on gas, the invitation is that you would stop at a gas station and put gas in your car. That way you don't find yourself on the side of I-4, stranded, hypothetically. Emotions indicate that something needs attention, that we should take appropriate response when we see that indicator go off. So here is a list of the 8 core building blocks of emotion that are important for addicts to become aware of. The feelings wheel we use is based on them. If you're starting out emotionally illiterate like I was, get used to these. take time daily to figure out what's going on inside. Become familiar with them. How do they feel in your body? It's like learning a new language. And it's one that's difficult to become fluent in. But these emotions, glad, sad, hurt, lonely, angry, afraid, guilt, and shame. Now, if you're anything like me, you look at the list and you're going to say, that's dumb. There's only one good emotion. Well, I'm gonna push back. I'm gonna challenge you a little bit here. They're all good and they're all useful emotions. They're just not all pleasant. They're not all fun to experience, but they're all good. They're all useful. Now, the second thing you might be thinking is, hold on, I don't see tired or frustrated on there, and that's all I ever feel. Every time I check in, it's tired, frustrated. Well, there's a reason for that. Those are the two words we normally use to cover up all the emotions we feel, but don't actually have the words to express. And so take, for instance, the word tired. There have been times, and maybe this is true for you as well, that I've just really, really worked hard all day. And I found myself at the end of the day tired, exhausted, but fulfilled and satisfied. Tired can be a really good feeling, but it's not a feeling, it's a state of being that often has a feeling attached to it. And so tiredness is a state of being that can be really rewarding or really debilitating. And so, trust me, I get this because emotions can be exhausting. So tired is usually an accessible word to talk about how we're feeling. I personally think that emotional work is far harder than physical or mental exertion. And so I'm not saying that when you say you're tired, it's not true. I'm saying don't use that word as an excuse to avoid being vulnerable with the people that are around you. Then there's frustrated. Often when we use this word, it represents a multitude of core emotions. And so it goes like this. Frustrated might mean, I'm afraid that I'm not going to meet my deadlines for work this week. And I kind of feel guilty that I spent last week so poorly. I'm a little bit angry at my boss for how much pressure he's putting on this deadline. Frustrated we often use it to mean a lot of different things that's going on in our experience. And we do that instead of letting others into the richness of our own emotional experience. We hide behind this word frustrated often. So I said before that emotions are indicators. They give us insight into our internal world, and they also are invitations. So this is what that means. We're not going to take time to explore all the roles of each emotion, but we're going to take one emotion as an example and talk about what it means for emotions to be invitations. And so we're going to use loneliness as our example. Not a pleasant feeling at all. But it's often a familiar one. In fact, it kind of sucks. I hate loneliness. But if loneliness is a light on our dashboard, what does it indicate? What is it saying to us when the loneliness light comes on? What does it mean? Well, it's telling us that's not the state that we were created to be in. In the garden, the only thing that God said was not good was, it is not good for man to be alone. We were created for relationship, for connection, to be in community with one another. And so when we're feeling disconnected from relationship, when we have this sense that my core needs aren't being met, loneliness can indicate to us that something's slightly out of whack in our relational world. So what does it do? It invites us to reach out to others for connection, for support. Now, however, as an addict, I don't often do that when I feel lonely. I generally do one of a couple things. Put duct tape over that light, say, I'm just gonna kind of ignore this loneliness, try and distract myself from it. I might isolate myself and try to make my surroundings match how I feel. And so if I feel lonely, then I shouldn't be around people because I need to make my surroundings match how I'm feeling inside. I'm gonna put on some sad and sappy music and wallow in self-pity. That's what I'm gonna do with my loneliness. Or I'm gonna move toward medicating my mood by acting out, using a substance, doing an action that's gonna alter my experience. And for me, that was pornography. Unfortunately, for a long time, my mentality towards emotions was, you can't fix sad, but you can fix sober. I thought emotions were just something that you couldn't do anything about except get high, get drunk, act out. If something's wrong, acting out can make it feel better. Getting to know your emotions and how they connect to your behaviors is really an integral part of regroup. That's why we do check-ins at the beginning of all of our small groups. I'm far less likely to act out when there are no unresolved emotions present in my day. Now, I have to admit that almost never happens for me. It almost seems like there's always something going on for me. But when I start to pay attention to what's going on inside, how I'm feeling, often what I notice is that I might have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 emotions from this list going on all at the same time. The energy of addiction is escape. So when I'm feeling that many unnamed and unresolved emotions, it's easy to go back to my coping mechanisms. It's easy to seek relief. I love talking to the guys at 33rd about this. And not long ago, I was talking about emotions, and after regroup, one of the guys came up to me and said, "Tim, I need you to pray for me. I'm feeling all of those things right now." I love that. I love when guys can begin to connect to what they're feeling. What a good first step, because recovery begins in honesty and reality, starting to name what's true about our present world. Next up are the roots that represent our thoughts and beliefs. Sometimes they can be right on the surface when we say things to ourselves that we believe, like, "I'm so stupid." But sometimes they're not so familiar. They're not so on the surface. Sometimes they're hidden away, buried in the midst of our stories. This is why we do inventory and sponsorship at Regroup. We want to get into the process of unrooting and replanting our tree, and that's best done in community. It's best done with a guide who has been there before, has done that before. Now, I think we'd be a little more accurate if we referred to these as false thoughts or false beliefs, because generally in these thoughts and beliefs that we have, there are subtle half-truths, exaggerations, or insinuations. Often they have just enough truth in them that we buy into it hook, line, and sinker. We believe these half-truths. Sometimes it's subtle, but sometimes it's outright and blatant shame that suggests that something is deeply broken about us. I want you to listen to some of these beliefs and see if any of them resonate with you. First, there are messages of shame. And these aren't all of the messages, but these are just a few. I'm invisible. I'm not lovable. I'm stupid. I'm not important. I'm not enough. I don't have what it takes. If people knew who I really am, they would not accept me. I'm worthless. I'm damaged. I'm ugly. I have nothing to offer. I'm alone. Messages that we pick up along the way in our lives. Relational messages like, no one can be trusted, or all men and women are fill in the blank. All men are selfish, all women are manipulative, whatever that is for you. Messages like, no one cares about me. No one is coming for me. Maybe there are prideful messages, and those go like this: I'm better than other people. I can do no wrong. I don't need others. I don't need help. Maybe messages about God. God can't be trusted. God won't show up for me. God doesn't love me. Prayer doesn't work. Now, I don't know if any of those resonate with you in your experience, but I could point to a lot of them that do for me. And these thoughts and beliefs that we have can wreak havoc on our emotional experience. And that creates this need for the coping mechanisms that we talked about earlier. It's important to note that we form these thoughts and beliefs in the soil of our environment. We were created to be loved perfectly, yet since the fall, none of us has ever had that experience. We get hurt, we get wounded, we experience betrayal and ridicule. And as we strive to make sense of our own pain, we develop these beliefs that, although they may fit our experience, they lose sight of the larger story of redemption that God is writing in the world. They a little bit short-sighted. And so that's where we take inventory of our lives. In community, we begin to enter in to tell these stories from the soil of our environment. It's the return movement of regroup. In sharing our experiences, we connect the dots of how our beliefs were shaped. We take a look at the most painful events of our lives, the crap. And then we look diligently at our response to those events. This is where the wound, the message, and the agreement comes into play that we talked about a couple weeks ago. When I was young, I was incredibly shy. And I had a really kind, loving grandpa, and I think he really meant well when he said this. But commenting on my shyness, he said, better to remain silent and appear a fool than to open your mouth and remove all doubt. You ever heard this parable, this proverb, this phrase? Better to remain silent and appear a fool than to open your mouth and remove all doubt. Now, I think this is a good proverb for somebody who's likely to open their mouth and say stupid stuff all the time. Like, hey, you might want to just reel it back in a little bit. Don't look so stupid when you're talking. But, thank you. That wasn't supposed to be funny, but I'm glad you liked it. So, yeah, I hear this, and I'm like, this could be a good proverb for somebody, but for a shy kid, for a shy little boy, what did I hear in that? This unintentional wound told me that I better never look incompetent in front of other people. The message was, you're most likely stupid, but just in case, you should never say anything in front of people to prove that. My agreement with the message was to stop offering my voice to the world. I quieted my insight, my story. And what a shame, because each one of us has stories that need to be heard. A few things that we look at when we move back into our stories, when we start to write our inventories. The first thing that we address, one of the important things that we address is our trauma. Now, trauma sounds like such a big, major word, and in some ways it is, but if we go back to the original Greek root of the word trauma, it literally means wound. And so we go back to these places where we've experienced hurt and loss, betrayal, heartbreak, and we begin to tell those stories. We address the abuse that's been done to us. We look at the ways that we've been abandoned. Because we were made to be loved perfectly, but we've never had that experience. And that leaves us with wounds. That leaves us with trauma. So we tell our stories and become known in order to bring light into some very dark places. And as we do so, we begin to see some themes emerge about our beliefs and our thoughts that were formed in this environment, in the soil of our lives. So we look at trauma, but we also look at our families and we look at our relationships. We look at our interactions with our parents, with our friends, our teachers, boyfriends, girlfriends. Where do your relationships go wrong? What are the patterns that emerge as you begin to tell the stories of your relationships? Relationships are an important part of our story. So we look at our trauma, we look at our relationships, but we also look at our own brokenness and our sinfulness. This is where we dig into what are the things that I struggle with? Where have I gotten off course in my life? And when did it start for you? How have you responded to your wounds? Go back to the beginning. If it's alcoholism, when did you first start drinking? If it's using sex for acceptance, what are the stories in your life that illustrate that? Maybe it's obsessing about your appearance. When did you first start becoming preoccupied with how you look, how others thought about how you looked? We look at how our actions have hurt others. We begin to write those things out in our inventory. We also pay close attention to the discrepancies in our stories. And this is where often a sponsor or someone like that can be helpful in reflecting back. 'Cause sometimes we're so immersed in our own stories, we can't see the discrepancies in our stories. I'll give you a good example of this. A couple months ago, I was at a conference and one of the presenters said this statement that I've had a hard time getting out of my head ever since. I think because of how it impacts my own story. It goes like this. Anxiety lives in the distance between a father who says, "I love you," but never calls. Anxiety lives in the distance between a father who says, "I love you," but he never calls. If that's your experience, if that's the soil that your roots are grounded in, you're left then to bridge the gap, to answer that question. If he loves me, why doesn't he engage in relationship with me? If he doesn't call, does that mean I'm not worth knowing? We're going to go ahead and actually diagram this out on the tree. And so, Dad loves me, but he never calls. So we wrestle to make sense of that discrepancy. We can, without even knowing it, begin to develop these beliefs of, I'm boring or I'm worthless. Now this belief then feeds our feelings. Shame, loneliness, anxiety, which is fear, sadness, hurt, anger. And then all of a sudden, a meaningless trip home where nothing eventful happens leads to an all-night binge that we can't seem to wrap our minds around the next day. And we're left wondering, how in the world could I ever have gone back to that place? You see it? Does that make sense? So how do we use the tree? First, journaling. I really like how Kaylee talks about journaling. Take a blank sheet of paper and write at the bottom what happened today. Right above that, write, these are what my thoughts were about what happened today. Then right above that, write, this is how I feel about what happened today. And this is how I feel about the thoughts about what happened today. Then above that, write out your response, or what you feel like doing, what you wish you would do to try and compensate for how you feel and for what's happened. And so what did you do as a result? Well, draw a tree around it, and you've just tree journaled. You're writing through your experiences, your thoughts and beliefs, your emotions, and your behaviors in response to that. Now, I don't journal this way, because I think there's really no wrong way to approach these connections. I'm actually a pretty sensitive dude that feels very deeply, and so growing up in a family that didn't permit emotions was really difficult. So, in my journey to become emotionally literate again, I always start at the trunk. I always start journaling with the words, today I feel. And then I grab a feelings wheel and I try and figure out what I'm feeling. And then I try to bridge the gaps from there. So this is what I'm feeling. What's happened in the last couple hours? What's happened in the last day that makes sense of what I'm feeling? How does this trigger my thoughts and my shame? And what does it make me want to do as a result? So you can start right in the trunk if that's helpful for you. This is helpful if you've relapsed. Start at the very top and work backwards. You have the behavior, it just happened. I looked at porn again. I got drunk again. So start at the top, write what it was, how you acted out. Then move down. What feelings were you trying to escape? What made life seem too unbearable? Go back into your experience, because the energy of addiction is escape. What were you trying to escape when you acted out? Where did you sense feeling or being out of control? What did you want relief from? Why did you want to feel better? What sent you back to your old coping mechanisms? What's been going on the past 24 hours, the past week, the past month? How did those events trigger your shame or your false beliefs? You can work your way back into the thoughts and beliefs that are rooted in your experience, that fuel your emotions, that fuel your acting out behavior. Relapse doesn't mean that you failed. Relapse simply means that there's more yet to be recovered. And that means when you find yourself in relapse, it's not, well, screwed up again, I might as well screw up as much as I can before I start the process over. No, it's what can I learn from this? What do I need in my life that has to be recovered yet? What needs to be restored? So here are just a few practical tips. Depending on what movement you're in, just some practical tips for using this. If you're in recognize, become familiar with your emotions. I know you may think you don't have them, but you do, trust me. Get to know them. Second, sobriety is important because it creates space for your emotions to rise to the surface, to be able to actually get at the roots underneath. You have to stop coping with your wounds before they can find any amount of healing. Acting out keeps you from actually having to enter into your emotions and your wounds. So sobriety is important. Third thing, if you're in recognize, journal. If you're in return, create a timeline if you haven't yet, or if you're getting ready to move into return. I know we have some guys in that category. Begin to create a timeline. Start by writing out the 25 most impactful events of your life. You can write them in order, you don't have to, but You can break them up into chronological order, however is easiest for you to make sense of this. But so for me, I would maybe write out early childhood, elementary school, middle school, high school, college at UCF, my first job at Lockheed Martin, working for Campus Crusade, grad school, post-grad school. Within all of these time frames, look at the events of your life. Be specific about what's happened, not just categories, but be specific about events. Number 2, work the grid. That's going to be the next step after you create your timeline. Put words on paper to your thoughts, feelings, and actions surrounding the events of your timeline. This is challenging, and so feel grace for yourself in this. It's hard work. It's some of the hardest work in a regroup. So feel free to step away from it when you need to. Connect frequently with others in your group. It's hard work, but begin to tell your story. And thirdly, journal. If you're in the Restore group, box events from your life in real time. A couple of years ago, this happened for me. I was trying to buy a motorcycle off of Craigslist. I went and I test drove it, and I heard all of these noises from the engine. I was like, I don't know what these noises are. And I just, later that day, I had this massive shame attack about how little I know about mechanics. And so as I started to walk through the box exercise, which is basically real-time tree journaling exercises, I discovered that I had these wounds that I had never learned about engines growing up. And it stirred up all this feeling of incompetence and broken masculinity. I was just a mess. But I had to see what was going on in my day and how my emotions were connected to my thoughts and how it connected to my experience of life, how it made me want to act out or behave in a certain way to medicate and numb all of that experience. I had to come back to the truth in that. So begin in real time to put these principles into practice. Secondly, share these events with others. Engage in community in real time with those that are around you. And thirdly, journal. Ultimately, I think the tree is an incredibly useful tool for us to get to know ourselves better, why we think, feel, act the way we do. It helps us get a more accurate picture of ourselves and our stories, and it gives us context out of which we can then tell our stories. And each one of us has a story that needs to be heard. Let's pray. Father, thank you for being the author of your story and also of our story. Thank you for inviting us into the hard work of seeing how you're not just in the sky and don't care about us, don't care about our lives, but we get to see how you want to be close to us, how you say to us that you'll never leave us nor forsake us. God, I pray that you would help us to be aware of your presence here with us even tonight. Help us to know that you are good and that you love us. And God, thank you for this opportunity and this journey that you have us on. And it's your name we pray. Amen.